Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Kjetil Storstetten. I am the director of the Heller-Hurwicz Economic Institute here at University of Minnesota. The Heller-Hurwicz Economic Institute has the mission of building a bridge between leading edge economic research that happens here on campus and the business leaders, policymakers, community members, government officials who can benefit from that research. We fulfill this mission through events like this webinar, through strategic communication, including office hours, podcast, policy briefs, etc. We're excited to welcome you to our webinar, which promises to be a very engaging conversation. We're joined by economists, policymakers, students, faculty, and you. Thank you all for being here. And now over to Chris Farrell.
There we go. Did I hit the button? There I did. Thank you. Well, thanks a lot. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion on does the Fed need to cause a recession to reduce inflation? And what we're going to do is Gary Stern is going to make some remarks and VV Chari are going to make some remarks. And then I have a whole bunch of questions that I would like to ask them. But then we really want to open it up to your questions. So while they're talking, while I'm asking questions, please send your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can during this hour. And I don't think, Gary, you need much or any introduction, but longtime head of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And I'd like to turn it over to you to make some opening remarks, and then we'll go to VV Chari, Professor of Economics at the University of Minnesota. Gary?
Well, thank you, Chris. And I'll be brief, but I'll start with the question posed. Does the Fed need to cause a recession in order to reduce inflation? And I think the question is a very good one because it's the conventional wisdom. I think that without question, that if the Federal Reserve is determined to bring inflation down, it needs to engineer a recession in the economy and all that goes with it, which are increases in unemployment, decreases in output, et cetera, et cetera. To be direct, I think the answer to that question, despite the fact that the conventional wisdom would say yes, I think the correct answer to the question is no. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. Despite the sort of intuitive appeal of answering the question positively, what's missing from much analysis when that question is considered is the credibility of the policymaker. And by that I mean, if the Federal Reserve is committed to low inflation, and if that commitment is credible, that means it's believed not just by Federal Reserve policymakers, but by participants in the economy, in the financial markets, et cetera, then it's certainly possible to achieve a reduction in inflation without a recession. And a lot of the initial research underpinning that conclusion was done by faculty members associated with the University of Minnesota and the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And in particular, I'm referring to work by Tom Sargent, now on the faculty of NYU, but when he was at Minnesota and also at the Fed, he published a paper dealing with the end of 4 big inflations that occurred in the 1920s in Europe. In Austria, Germany, Czech, and a couple of other countries there. And those countries achieved very sudden and sharp, basically ends of very rapid hyperinflation by changing the policy regime and instituting a regime that was credible, that the public believed would indeed bring down inflation significantly. And it's important to look at the evidence, obviously, and at the historical record, and to learn from that. And the key element, or certainly one key element in Federal Reserve history that accomplished the same thing, was during Paul Volcker's tenure as chair, beginning back in 1979, 1980, bringing down the very rapid inflation of the 1970s. And it's very important to recognize, and it's embarrassing if you were a Federal Reserve official. If you look back at the record of that period, you'll see many Federal Reserve officials trying to make the argument that there was nothing they could do about double-digit inflation. They either attributed it to cost push, or they attributed it to developments in the energy markets and elsewhere over which they had little influence and no control. When Paul Volcker became chair, and he was appointed chair by President Carter more or less out of desperation to do something about inflation, when Paul Volcker became chair, he embarked on, and not only did he embark on a very aggressive program to bring down inflation, but he, of course, brought the Open Market Committee, the key policy group in the Fed, with him. He had the courage to not only institute the policy, but to stay with it, despite the fact that unemployment rose significantly, and despite the fact that it took some time for inflation to come down. He established, I think what Paul Volcker and his colleagues did was establish the credibility of the Fed. They made a credible commitment to reduce inflation, and that has served the U.S. economy well, and Federal Reserve policymakers well, for that matter, for 3 or 4 decades now. So it was a very major accomplishment, not easily done, but one that proved to have, in my judgment, lasting benefits. And I think with that, Chris, I'll stop and happily turn it over to Chari or to you.
Chari, why don't we turn it over to you now? There you go.
Thank you, Chris. So what I'm gonna say in substantial part is going to echo what Gary said. So let's take the question head on. In August of 2022, the inflation rate, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, was rising at an annual rate of well over 8%. It peaked in August of 2022 at about 8.2%. The most recent reading is 3.3%. So if the question is, and of course we haven't had any recession, we've had robust economic growth, relatively low unemployment rates, and so on. So if the question is, did the Fed need to engineer a recession to reduce the inflation rate over the course of the last 16 or 17 months? History has already answered that question. No. But I think the spirit of the question is a more general one. Is it the case that in general, when inflation rates run high, we do need to have a recession in order to bring the inflation rate down? And as Gary said, the textbook answer to this question, and these are textbooks and papers written by people, including Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, including leading members of the Federal Reserve System, including leading academics. The textbook answer is definitively yes. In general, you do need to bring inflation rates down. That was the conventional and is the conventional view in the textbooks. Textbooks need to be rewritten. I think, as Gary pointed out, the decisive contrast is, or one decisive contrast, there are many that we could point to, is between the policies that were needed to reduce inflation rates from their highs in the 70s and early 80s down, and they came down very dramatically from about 13% down to, as measured by the CPI, down to about 3.5% over a course of 3 or 4 years, were accompanied by a very steep recession, then the steepest recession in the post-war era, unemployment rate skyrocketed, and people like Paul Volcker and Gary Stern, I should point to Gary Stern as well, were the subject of heavy abuse at the time. You people don't know what you're doing. Why does the unemployment rate have to go up so much? There were repeated calls for price controls from people who'd go on to win Nobel Prizes, all using essentially the same intellectual framework that said that prices and inflation rates can only be brought down by inducing severe slack in labor markets. The most recent experience has pretty much decisively put paid to that view. So what's the difference? I want to echo what Gary said. I think the central difference between the episode of the late 70s and early 80s is that was a period when the Federal Reserve System lacked credibility. People in the market and households in general didn't really trust that the Fed was committed to keep inflation rates down. I think the price that they paid, the policymakers then, people like Paul Volcker and Gary Stern, they paid a very severe price for that. And we as a people paid a very severe price for that because unemployment rates did skyrocket. But now we're reaping the rewards of the sacrifices that were made in the early 80s. And the rewards now come with the conviction on the part of markets that the Federal Reserve will not let inflation rates get out of hand. We'll get into the details. I think they were a little bit slow in their actions this time relative to what they should have done. But that is, I think, a relatively minor complaint. In the big spirit of things, they moved aggressively, they raised interest rates aggressively, they proclaimed repeatedly their intention to ensure that inflation rates would stay low independently of what happened to the economy. And they've been fairly successful so far at bringing the inflation rates down. And it's still above their target, but certainly looks like it's going to fall to their target. And that's not the only example. So the answer to the question, do high inflation rates, can they be cured only by a severe recession, is it depends. Like any economist, I've got to say it depends. It depends, but it depends on what? It depends on what the credibility of the central bankers and the policymakers is. If they have high credibility with respect to their commitment to low inflation rates in the future, inflation rates can be brought down relatively painlessly. If they lack credibility, which has been much too often the case, then unfortunately, they are going to have to risk, and the public at large is going to have to experience high rates of unemployment, severe recessions to bring inflation rates down. Let me stop at that.
Okay, so in terms of what's wrong with the standard model, I mean, you take Larry Summers, terrific economist. He gave a speech in June of 2020 in London, and what he said there in 2020, and he said 2022, I'm sorry, not 2020, 2022, and he said, we need 5 years of unemployment above 5% to contain inflation. In other words, we need 2 years of 7.5% unemployment, or 5 years of 6% unemployment, or 1 year of 10% unemployment. And, but that, the thing about it, he put numbers there, right? But you read the Financial Times, you read the Wall Street Journal, you read the New York Times. Basically, that was the message that economist after economist, whether they were associated with a university or they were associated with a Wall Street firm, that's the basic message they gave. So what's the flaw there? What is the mistake with that model, which is widespread? Chari?
Well, I'll tackle that first. I mean, I'd say two things about it. I mean, they're implicitly assuming, as Chari has emphasized, that the central bank, in our case, the Federal Reserve, lacks credibility. And so they're basically using a model that goes back to the 1950s, the Phillips curve, which posits a trade-off between labor market conditions and inflation. And the model the essence of the model is, other things equal, the lower the unemployment rate, the higher the rate of inflation. If the rate of inflation is too high by however you judge it as being too high, the only way for it to be reduced over time is for unemployment to go up in all likelihood significantly. That is the rationale, the intuition that a lot of the people you cited start with, and for that matter, end with. And I think the Phillips curve model, despite its obvious shortcomings in current circumstances, has proven to be at best a inadequate guide to inflation, to the inflation unemployment relation for a long time now. And various analysts have tried to repair the model with various adjustments to it, trying to make it in some sense more sophisticated and adding variables that may or may not give you better results. But as they proceeded with that effort, they've all been one-offs. That is, they may work for one episode in one period of time in one country, but they haven't succeeded in a lasting way. So I really think it's about time that people took a look at that model much more skeptically than is typically the case even today. And I'll stop there.
Chari?
So Larry Summers is one of the finest analysts of data, one of the finest empirical economists out there. The people who write textbooks and the people who, including Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, the people who make policy are all people who are experts at looking at the data. For the vast majority of our experience over the last 60, 70 years, we have lived in a regime where central banks have lacked credibility. In that regime, if you systematically see over and over again that inflation rates sometimes do go up, and every time they come back down, there's a recession, you have to be an idiot not to conclude that a recession is needed this time as well. I don't think Larry Summers is an idiot. I don't think any of these people is. What, as Gary emphasized, they needed to do was to look more carefully at that experience, contrast it with the experience that Tom Sargent documented for the hyperinflations in Europe in the 1920s, and see that a unified theory is going to have to take into account the credibility of the central bank in that regime. And so I think that they made the best analysis, but they made an analysis which was based largely on reading the tea leaves of the data rather than thinking harder about the underlying forces. Now, what Gary was emphasizing about the more and more fancy add-ons that people have tried to do in order to get the Phillips curve to fit the data is right on. It reminds me of, Ptolemy in the 3rd century before Christ came up with the model of the world in which the Earth was at the center, and the planets and the sun rotated around the Earth. Now, as measurement got more and more sophisticated, sailors found that the Ptolemaic model wasn't fitting very well. And so what was the response on the part of very smart empirical astronomers? They invented epicycles, cycles, epicycles, pericycles, more and more complicated versions. And it took Copernicus and Kepler and others to say, maybe you should just rethink what's at the center of the solar system. Maybe it's not the Earth. And that revolutionized astronomy. It also revolutionized navigation and sailing and so on and so forth, and allowed us to launch satellites into outer space. But that rethinking was needed. And I really do think that we do need to go back and rethink it. And I suspect that once we rethink these issues, we will put credibility and commitment squarely at the center of the discussion. In all fairness, one of the leaders of the movement towards inflation targeting, which has been worldwide, has been important work that Larry Summers and Alberto Alesina did in the late 80s and early 90s. That empirical work influenced a lot of countries to move towards inflation targeting. So I think it's possible for great economists like Larry Summers to get some things right and some things wrong. But the only way I know how to get things consistently right is to have the correct theoretical framework. I'm not sure he has it. I'm much more confident that a bunch of people located in Minnesota and Chicago and so on have a better theoretical framework for thinking about this. But we're still a long way from being able to solve all aspects of this problem.
So Gary, in terms of credibility, and you were there, so what role did the 2% target, the evolution toward the 2% target, what role did that play in terms of thinking about credibility?
Well, I would say that first of all, the 2% target isn't derived scientifically. I think the idea, the Fed kind of got there over a series of meetings, kind of by the process of elimination. I won't go through all of that. The idea was to identify a target that was credible, that seemed to be consistent with low inflation, and that could be achieved. I don't know that there's anything magic about 2%, but it's not difficult to imagine that if you had picked a target significantly higher, it might not have been credible. And if you picked a target significantly lower, I think the concern was that you might run more of a risk of deflation than you wanted to. And while deflation can be a mixed bag in terms of economic consequences, I don't think there was any sentiment or impetus at the time to run that risk or raise that specter. So 2% seemed like an appropriate target that the committee, the Open Market Committee, the key policy group in the Fed, could agree to. The European Central Bank at the same time came up with a target that said basically 2% or a little bit lower. And speaking for myself, but obviously not for the committee, that target had even a little more appeal to me because I was willing to tolerate a little more willing to tolerate errors on the downside than on the upside. But I think the target has, as it turns out, it has served us well. And I think we have to give Federal Reserve policymakers, current Federal Reserve policymakers, credit for not only sticking with the target. I haven't seen any Federal Reserve official even raise the possibility of changing the target and increasing it, which I think is important when you're in a world where commitment and credibility matter a lot. And obviously that's the world that Chari's been talking about and the world that we're in.
And I'm going to get to this on the questions from the audience in a minute, but I do want to ask you, Chari, there were a number of, very persuasive, very good articles from leading economists saying, look, 2% is too strict a target. Let's go to 4%. And what was your reaction to that idea, and how does that feed into this whole issue of credibility?
I think one word, harder. It may be right to revisit the 2% target. As Gary emphasized, it's somewhat arbitrary. There's no strong scientific background that says 2% is the right number. When do you want to revisit it? I would think you'd want to revisit it after you've had several years, right around 2%. Say, we want to revisit it. Makes a lot of sense. When do you not want to revisit it? When you're running at 8%. So let me expand on that. One of the things, Gary briefly mentioned this, one of the things that strikes me as a little bit of a historian of the 70s, is the repeated insistence by senior policymakers, including Chairman Arthur Burns, that inflation was not their fault, was not their problem. It was caused by oil prices, Russian embargo, oil embargo, the breakdown of Bretton Woods. It's not my fault. It's not your fault. It's the fault of that man behind the tree. That was their repeated insistence all through the 70s. That is what I think made inflation in the 70s very persistent and very difficult to conquer. The other aspect that made inflation very difficult to conquer, you saw this over and over again, is they'd tighten. There'd be a small reduction in inflation rates, sometimes a fairly large one. And they'd say, oh, they declare victory, let's move on, touchdown, let's loosen policy again. And those kinds of stop and go policies, I think, led to a severe loss of credibility. What's the big difference once Chairman Volcker took over and people like Gary played a much bigger role? They stood up and said, this is our fault. It's me. Unless I, and by I, they meant the entire Open Market Committee and all the policymakers, unless we are willing to take the tough steps needed, inflation will not come down. That was a signal change in policy. What I find remarkable, there are lots of problems, by the way, with the commitment and credibility story, which I'm happy to elaborate on. It's not, that can't be the whole story. But what I find striking is that inflation rates start taking off around March of 2021. First time it crosses 4, and then marches steadily up. And then the Federal Reserve, first tentatively, and then very decisively in their July meeting, in the July meeting, they raised the federal funds rate by 75 basis points. Not only did they raise it by 75 basis points, they made it very clear that we were in for successive rounds of 75 basis point increases in the federal funds rate. The tone that the policymakers had used until then was, oh, this is transitory. This is transitory. And I think in their July meeting, if I'm not right, if I'm not wrong, Chairman Powell banished the use of the word transitory. Said, we're not going to use the word transitory anymore. Those were important signals. Guess what? The inflation rate, at least as measured by the CPI, peaks in August of 2022. And after that, it just marches down very steadily. There are blips along the way. And the Federal Reserve says, no, we're going to stay the course. We're going to keep interest rates relatively high. We're going to keep raising interest rates up until this demon is conquered. And so demonstrating that resolve, I think, was critical. And the failure to demonstrate that resolve in the 70s led to the problem in the 70s. The willingness to demonstrate that resolve in the most recent episode, I think, is a heartening sign of how far we've come in terms of policymaking.
So I want to get back to this issue about credibility, but first I want to go to a question, and it's from Nicolini, because you'd mentioned persistence. And the Volcker stabilization came after a rise in inflation that had been much more persistent. Simple statistical analysis shows that an upward trend in inflation starting in the late 1960s. This recent episode appears to be much less persistent. Would that make a difference in terms of the real effect of a disinflation program?
I think that's a really, really good question. Wampa is a co-author of mine and a good friend, and I will remind him of something that he knows, which is the persistence of inflation is an endogenous variable. The persistence of inflation depends on the attitude and the perspective of policymakers and how they communicate that. If policymakers are perceived as not having much credibility, inflation will be very persistent. If policymakers are perceived as having high credibility, inflation rates will fall. One classic example of this, I have lots of objections to the gold standard, but the gold standard was remarkably good as a commitment device. What did we see during the gold standard period all across the world, in the UK, the US? Inflation rates would go up, not to 8%, but they did rise on occasion with wars and so on, fairly dramatically. And they came down, boom, 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 boom. It just didn't display any persistence at all. That was remarkable. So that was the advantage of having commitment, is that it reduces the persistence of inflation. Now, the gold standard had lots of problems. In particular, the lack of flexibility of the gold standard is, I think, a serious indictment of it. So you have to find the right balance between being committed to a long-run target and being flexible enough to accommodate shorter-term disturbances. But you need that commitment to that longer-run target to be able to accommodate short-term disturbances most effectively.
So one of the advantages of being a moderator is you get to ask really naive questions. So Gary, you're in these meetings with the Fed. You can see credibility with hindsight, but how do you measure credibility? How do you measure that the decisions you're making with all the uncertainty that is out there, that this is enhancing credibility? Because, for example, the Fed, sometimes they talk too much, sometimes they talk too little. There's been all this communications problem. So how did you think about credibility in these meetings?
In my experience, Chris, well, that's an interesting question. I'm not aware that the Fed has spent any significant resources on the credibility question. By which I mean, I can't recall a discussion where somebody said, well, our credibility is at X%, or something like that. I think people do understand, having said that, I think people do understand that if they make a commitment to bring inflation down, they have to stick with that commitment. It's kind of a time consistency argument. But if you look at Fed statements, and I think Fed statements are accurate in the sense that they're not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes or anything like that. I think or maybe the more positive way to put it is credibility. You can talk all you want, but credibility is earned. That's what it boils down to. And so you have to conduct policy in a way that's consistent with your statements, and your statements, of course, have to be consistent with the policy you're conducting. And I would add, and I don't think that has been much of a problem for the Fed recently, but back in the Volcker years, one of the things Paul accomplished, and this wasn't easy, was that he built support, or at least tolerance, for a very restrictive monetary policy. Restrictive, by which I mean very high nominal interest rates and associated significant increases in unemployment. Because you can't, the Fed can't over time impose policies on the country for which there's no support. And what Volcker did, and people haven't faced that challenge to the same degree since he was chairman, but what Volcker did, managed to do, was to build tolerance for some very difficult medicine. And as Chari noted earlier, that has served the U.S. Economic performance well for decades. And we've reaped some of the benefits of that recently.
So let me read a question. This one's come, let me get over here from, this one is from Mark Schultz. He says, since the peak inflation rate in August 2022, the markets have experienced significant goods disinflation. Oil and food prices have dropped 30 to 40%, creating downward inflation pressure. Service inflation has remained sticky and higher, which seems correlated to the low unemployment rate and higher labor costs. Do you agree with the correlation of low unemployment and let me get it again, and services? Chari?
Sure. No, I think Gary might be able to answer that better. One of the things we know about all disinflationary episodes is that there's not been a single disinflationary episode where all prices have uniformly drifted down or the inflation rates have uniformly declined. It's always the case that some inflation rates tend to fall faster, and others more slowly, creates sectoral dislocations. And the temptation for policy, this happened in the 70s, by the way, where there was significant concern, especially about food and fuel prices, inflation rates outstripping inflation rates in other markets, and what the disinflationary policy would do to unemployment rates in industries quite far away from food and fuel. Here's the deal. It's always possible and sometimes easy to find excuses for saying, well, we're going to go more slowly this time because of all of these problems. And all of them are legitimate stories. What policymakers have to always keep in mind is it possible to do that without undermining the overall credibility of the enterprise? So when we say that Paul Volcker and Gary Stern engineered policies which had the unpleasant side effect of raising unemployment rates very substantially, it was not something they did because they wanted to, because they somehow relished the idea of people being unemployed. No, it was an unfortunate price that they felt that they had to pay, a sacrifice that they felt the country had to go through, so that later on, like now, the country doesn't have to pay such a big price. So yes, there are going to be sectoral dislocations, but I think that's not responding too much to them or finding the right balance there is, I think, important for ensuring that inflation rates overall return to normal relatively quickly.
Gary?
You know, Chris, I think I might put it a little more strongly than Chari. In my experience, you always get in trouble if you start telling specific stories about specific subcomponents of price indexes and things like that. I mean, inflation is inflation, and some prices go up more rapidly than others. That's always the case when you're in a disinflationary environment. Some prices slow more or decline. And I tend to, a lot of that is just noise, and I don't pay a heck of a lot of attention. Now, it's well known that the Fed likes to look at price indices excluding food and energy. And for analytical purposes, the rationale for that is straightforward. Food can be subject to weather conditions around the world, and nothing monetary policy can do that. And energy can have a political component, as we know, and there's nothing monetary policy can do about that. But if you're asking the question, what is inflation and what do households care about? Well, they don't care whether food and energy they're spending money on food and energy. They don't care whether there's special factors affecting them or not. So what variable you want to use depends on what question you're asking. And if you're a policymaker, yeah, you want to be a little careful about food and energy for the reason I said, but you shouldn't kid yourself saying that food prices went up because there was a drought in the valley or something. Doesn't matter to the consumer.
And that kind of leads to this next question from George Herrera. Does the source of inflation matter to answer the question? Example, excess of demand versus trade frictions, war in Ukraine, etc. Even increases in margins by firms in sectors with low competition. If so, how does it change the optimal policy decision for the Fed?
Well, I'll give a
Gary?
short response to that. I think Chari probably will have something more insightful and sophisticated to say than I will. But as I've already indicated, I don't think there's a lot of mileage to be gained to telling individual stories about various parts of the various inflation measures, because something is always going on. I mean, and those stories might be interesting, but the question is, are they revealing, and do they help you understand the world? Now, having said that, the current bout of inflation, I mean, we knew there were some supply side, everybody knew there were some supply side disruptions. Everybody should have known that that was adding to inflation for a time. And that was expected, and all of that was expected to be transitory. Well, transitory or not, it wasn't as transitory as expected to be. And the Federal Reserve ultimately decided to act reasonably aggressively to bring inflation down. So, you know, as I said, I'm pretty cautious and pretty leery about sort of micro-analysis of inflation. You know, Milton Friedman said, inflation is everywhere a monetary phenomenon, or something like that. And we're in a more complicated world than that today. But you know, there's an essence, there's a kernel of truth in it, nevertheless.
Chari, anything to add?
Yeah, no. I think that's exactly right. Look, you have to have the challenge of making policy. Anybody can make policy if policy did not involve what we call a huge signal extraction problem. You have a lot of data which you're observing, and you have to figure out which signals in that data are reliable enough to warn us about substantial increases in underlying inflation rates, which should be ignored, which should be set aside. So those kinds of judgments are an important part of policy. The one thing that I would add, which I think is an important part of policy, but is not emphasized enough in the books, is every time you're going to solve that problem of trying to extract the signal from all the noise, you have to worry about how that's going to alter perceptions of the public towards your ultimate long-run target. So as long as you take that adequately into account, of course, you should look at all the data that comes in and make the best informed judgment. But you should always worry about, does that mean that people will lose confidence? So one illustration of this point is, I think that the Fed was a little bit too slow to get off the ground. And they argued that the inflation rates that we were seeing starting in 2021 into 2022 were largely transitory due to supply chain disruptions and so on and so forth. And my attitude to that is, if you are a good Bayesian, that is, if you balance the likelihood that you could be wrong with the likelihood that you could be right, that means that you should give some weight to the possibility that you are wrong, that in fact it is not transitory. And so therefore, when I say that really they should have moved earlier, it's mainly based on those kinds of considerations. Right? Consider the possibility that you are wrong, as Thomas Cromwell pleaded way back in the 13th century. You have to take that into account. That's why I think that slightly more aggressive moves sooner might have helped a lot. But the overall theme of the question is right. You should analyze all the data that comes in and make the best possible judgment.
So a follow-up question for you and Gary on that point, but I first want to go, General, you have a question?
Yeah. So I feel that the panelists, you agree too much. So I mean, your basic argument is that, yeah, the Fed commits to low inflation. The population believes in that inflation target, and just the mere expectation that inflation is coming down, that's enough. That's enough to deliver low inflation. It sounds very easy. Now, what is it? Suppose, imagine I doubt it. I believe it, but imagine I doubt it. What is it I can see out there that suggests that that view is right? Over and above, of course, yeah, we can see that inflation is coming down now. We're getting a soft landing, but it's something else that suggests that that expectation view is the right one.
Maybe I'll take a crack at that. Let me give Gary a couple of minutes. It's a really good question, Cheryl. My answer to these questions is you can look at lots of sophisticated data, but at the end of the day, there's one big piece of data you should be constantly looking at, which is the inflation rate. Look at the inflation rate. If that sucker is not coming down at the rate that you would like it to, you've got to be more aggressive. If it is, then you're doing the right thing. Part of the problem with looking at all kinds of different data, so let me confess, one huge problem with the commitment view. One huge problem with the commitment view is that the view that the inflation rate took off from March 2021 to August of 2022, that was entirely caused by credibility problems, is suspect because we don't see the concomitant increase in long-term nominal interest rates that we would have if credibility were the sole cause of those disruptions. We did not see a huge movement in long-term nominal interest rates. So that is a strike against the credibility view. And on the other hand, the credibility view has a lot going for it. I just find it's got to be more than a coincidence that pretty much almost as soon as the Fed signals that they are going to be very aggressive about this, they're going to be single-mindedly about this, inflation rates peak. Now, that could be just coincidence, just happened that way. The reason why that isn't convincing is that supply chain problems, as measured by the price of shipping goods, have already started declining starting in January of 2022. The supply chain is already healing quite rapidly. So those excuses are beginning to fall out of favor. And there are a variety of other things that we can say about the transitory inflation rate view. They become less and less tenable as 2022 goes on. What is the one thing that does turn it around? A dramatic move combined with a commitment to undertake similarly dramatic moves. Now, is that the whole story? No, it cannot be. In the real world, the actual story is a combination of all of those. So is it solely commitment problems? No. It's also that there were, in fact, supply chain disruptions. We were coming out of COVID. Nobody knew what the new shape of the workplace, at home, at work, maybe in the car, maybe in a vacation spot that people are in pretending to work. All of that reshaping is going on, and those create real problems in extracting the signals. But I think so. So the real world is a complex of all of these issues. But how do you tell if you're doing right? If you're doing the right thing? Are inflation rates coming down?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, I think that's you don't have the counterfactual, obviously. What would have happened had the Fed done a different policy and commitment, had either been called into question or commitment had strengthened, and we just don't know. The only thing I would add to that is, the Fed always tells us that they're data dependent. And what that means, of course, is they analyze all the incoming, and they're very good at this. They analyze all the incoming data on the domestic and global economy and try to assess whether that's consistent with their view of the world and consistent with the policy course they're on or not, and if not, do they need to adjust policy? And so as things have come in, it's been, nothing has deterred them from staying the course, and I think that's important. Maybe they've just been lucky. That's always a possibility, but I think a better explanation is the one that Chari and I have been talking about, that there's a credible commitment to low inflation, and policymakers and economic participants have benefited from it.
So there are two questions, pretty much similar themes, one from Jordan Pandolfo and one from Anonymous. And Jordan says, can you comment on the role of fiscal policy within the current monetary cycle and more broadly within the model framework for thinking about monetary policy and inflation? And Anonymous says, writes, Sargent's work on inflation placed an emphasis on fiscal policy and the role of government budget constraints and inflationary expectations. Do the panelists have any thoughts on the role of fiscal policy and credibility have played in recent experience? So this role of fiscal policy in this discussion.
That's, I think, a huge ball game. I talked about supply chains and talked about expansionary monetary policy. During COVID, for good reasons or for ill, we pursued an extraordinarily expansionary fiscal policy, made very significant transfers to lots of people, many of whom were suffering, some of whom were not. And then immediately after the Biden administration took over, the Biden administration came up with a series of legislative proposals, 3 of which were enacted, which very, very dramatically increased prospective budget deficits. When Larry Summers warned that these budget deficits would lead to high inflation, he was poo-pooed, and he was told, Larry, you should reapply to presidency of Harvard, or something like that. What are you doing? Don't say these things. And serious economists took their turn beating up on poor Larry. We've sort of said Larry was wrong in his forecast about disinflation and recession, but he was dead on in his forecast about the higher inflation. So did the irresponsible, I really do think it was irresponsible fiscal policy to some extent the Trump administration, certainly the Biden administration early on, did that play an important role? I think it did. What role do I think it played? The role it played was people could see that happening. And the question is, how would the Fed respond? And the Fed responded, at least initially for the first year and a half, by pursuing a very expansionary monetary policy. Not surprisingly, that led to some concerns, in my judgment, about the credibility of the Fed and played an important role. So I think that aspect of fiscal policy played an important role. There's something else that Tom has emphasized in his work, and I'm not so sure it's that critical. Tom has emphasized that the way you get credible monetary policy is by getting the fiscal policy house in order. I'm not so sure that the historical experience is that decisive in that regard. The experience of the US in the 70s and 80s, for example, is a good illustration. Do you know what the debt to GDP ratio in the 70s was in the United States? It was 25%. It was 106% immediately after the war. We're back to over 100%. Will be very shortly. 25% is nothing. And so the idea that fiscal policy irresponsibility played an important role in the 70s. Remember that long before Reagan deficits, the inflation rate was tamed. And so I don't think that the historical evidence is that decisive on that issue. Our fiscal policy continues to display breathtaking irresponsibility and I don't see high inflation rates. So I'm not so sure that the link between fiscal policy and inflation is that tight. I think the link is an indirect one. That is, expansionary fiscal policy is dangerous to the extent that it contributes to concerns about overly expansionary monetary policy.
Gary?
I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think Chari ended it as I would have, only more eloquently.
Okay, so in listening to this, I mean, part of our, obviously now let's take a look ahead. And what are some of the implications looking ahead? And there's this whole question, is the Fed going to start? And March has been, the March FOMC meeting has been the date that a lot of people on Wall Street are saying the Fed should cut. Now, one reaction to this discussion is the Fed should just cut, just simply go back to where it was back in 2019 or wherever with its benchmark interest rate because it's got its credibility. So why drag this whole process out?
Well, first of all, you haven't reestablished 2% inflation, just to state the obvious. So it hasn't
pretty close, though.
Hasn't achieved the target. The other thing I would add about this, and I happened to hear a speech by Chris Waller, who's a Fed governor, who made the point, and it resonated with me, and I'm willing to entertain other views, certainly. That look, at some point, basically what he was saying was, look, at some point we're going to be cutting rates, but there's no urgency because there's no crisis. The economy has been performing well. The unemployment rate is low. The labor market is strong. Many jobs are available. So there's, and as I said, we haven't achieved 2% inflation yet. So, I mean, the argument he was making was we have plenty of time to analyze the situation, to cut rates if and as it appears to be appropriate, and there's no urgency. And by the way, we shouldn't kid ourselves here. I mean, the U.S. economy is a very large, sophisticated, resilient, flexible economy. Whether the Fed cuts rates in March or in June or September, that isn't likely to be all that decisive, in my judgment. The economy isn't that sensitive to those kinds of things, in my view. And if you were 2 or 3 months ahead or 2 or 3 months behind in modest rate reductions, I don't think that's going to have a profound effect on anything. So as long as your rationale for what you're doing is sensible. So I think that's an issue that is not worth getting all that excited about at this point in time. I think if you had told many analysts during the pandemic or shortly thereafter, or for that matter in the middle of 2022, that we were going to be sitting here at the beginning of 2024 with unemployment well below 4% and inflation coming down substantially, they would have said the likelihood of that is close to zero. And of course, they would have been wrong, fortunately.
Chari?
Look, I think I have to be a good Bayesian. You have to follow the inflation rate. You have to pay attention to it. And I criticize them for not having been good Bayesians and moved interest rates up in 2021, thinking they might be wrong. And as a good Bayesian, part of this depends on your judgment of what's called the so-called neutral rate, which is the interest rate that would prevail when, in fact, the inflation rate is at the target. And unless you think that that's gone up a lot, it merits a gradual, watchful decline, perhaps starting in March. You shouldn't be too slow to cut rates, I have to confess, because I criticize them for being too slow to raise them. So I wouldn't be criticizing them if they were too slow also. Again, it's a question of being watchful, looking at the data, worrying a lot about credibility, and taking every opportunity. I should mention one episode that's really important. for us all to keep in mind. And Gary was president of the Minneapolis Fed at the time and played an important role in this. In the 90s, if our listeners and watchers remember, the unemployment rate at the time was falling during the internet boom, and output was growing pretty rapidly. And there were lots of people who bought into the Phillips curve kind of notion, who wanted interest rates to be raised fairly dramatically to forestall rises in inflation. And Chairman Greenspan and policymakers like Gary said, no, we don't see it in inflation yet. So why are we overreacting to this Phillips curve notion, which is very unstable and lacks clear theoretical foundations? Why are we relying on that? Let us raise rates only when we see inflation rates go up. And I think to some extent the Fed did the same sort of thing in the 2010s. They said, until we see inflation rates actually going up, we're not going to be aggressive about this. And the same sort of thing should be true. When we see inflation rates going down, we should also be not aggressive necessarily, but certainly watchfully ready to lower rates as needed.
So we're reaching the end of our time. And so want to end it. I'll go with you, Gary, first, then Chari. A last thought, off this conversation, the inflation, thinking about the economy, employment, sort of a last thought to leave with people. Gary?
The last thought that I would leave people with is that I hope we take this episode seriously, because I don't think it's a one-off. I think it does, as we're kind of ending where we started. I think it demonstrates the importance of commitment and credibility. I think you ought, if you're trying to analyze policy and you're trying to analyze what it means for the economy, and indeed what developments in the economy mean for policy, you should be adding concerns and focus about credibility and commitment to the list of variables, the list of things you're interested in. I think it's exceedingly important to do that. I think the historical evidence underpinning that is ample, and so I would leave people with that thought.
Chari?
Yeah, I want to echo that. So we really stand on the verge of a long period of time, perhaps a decade, perhaps a couple of decades ahead of us, when, at least from a cyclical standpoint, we are apt to experience the rewards of the sacrifices undertaken by previous generations. The nature of modern economy is that occasionally inflation rates will fluctuate. Occasionally they will rise. If policymakers at central banks have credibility, if they're committed to the long term, to keeping their eyes single-mindedly on inflation in the long term, we can successfully see those episodes result in fairly costless disinflations. It's easy to lose that commitment and that credibility. The history of central banking, the history of monetary policy is an unfortunate history where flexibility, discretion, let us just do the right thing. We don't want to hurt people. Do you really want to have people on the streets selling apples? Is that the economy that you envision for us? If we just ran inflation a little bit hotter, we could solve a lot of problems in society. Those tempting songs of Circe will always be with us. We give that up at our peril. If we do stick to the painful lessons of the past, it's going to maybe painful in the short term, but we will reap large rewards for many decades to come.
Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this discussion, and this discussion will be on the Heller-Hurwicz website, so people will be able to, who didn't have a chance to attend, will be able to listen to it. But thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.